Okay, thank you everybody for joining us and our patience because technology always gets the best of us. But here we are, our second episode of the Democratic Dilemma. One of the reasons why we want to have these conversations is there's a theme happening across our state, and it is about data centers is one of the key topics. Last week we talked about education, and we will be circling back to these conversations. I want you to know these are not one and done conversations. Where do we start here? I'm going to start by introducing our guests because we have an amazing panel to bring us up to speed on what's happening across the state regarding data centers. And I'm just going to jump right in. I'm going to start with Jan. Jan, why don't you introduce yourself and we'll go from there.
Sure, thanks, Mary. I'm Jan Cervelli. I'm a professor at St. Mary's College. I'm the former president here. I'm also by training an urban planner and a landscape architect.
Awesome. Thank you. Cindy.
Hi, I'm Cinde Wirth. I'm a biologist and anthropologist, and I am running for U.S. Congress in Indiana 6th District, where we have, at minimum, 3 of these data centers currently under proposal and 1 that's been withdrawn.
Awesome. Okay. Michelle, please jump in.
Yes, so I'm a former House candidate and director of the Indiana Rural Summit. We organize House and Senate candidates across Indiana. In what is my House district, there is a proposed data center coming through. And then across our network of candidates, there's several. So this is a fight that we are very much invested in.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, everybody, for those brief and direct introductions, and we're going to get to know you folks more as we dive into the conversation. Where I want to start today is we have some eminent data centers in the works and planning. They're already down the tracks, and that's where we have a lot of people showing up in community, learning more of what's happened. But I want to pull the curtain back and talk about how did we get here? How did we get here where Indiana is facing approximately 70 plus data centers across our state? And I want to start with the State House because I really believe when we understand what the big strategy is here, we can get better at fighting it on the ground. So Jan, I want you to jump in here with your experience, your understanding. A lot of it has to go back to economic development. So let's start there, Jan. I want to have you jump in.
Well, thank you. I'm not exactly the expert on the statewide strategy, but I know how it's played out here in St. Joseph County. I think that a lot of it is wrapped around economic development and the generation of new jobs and in tax revenue for localities and helping the state overall in increasing wages and jobs. Here it started with the development of this kind of a high-tech industrial park on the western side of the county and kicked off with a battery plant, Samsung GM partnership, which I think caught a lot of attention in a positive way during the Biden administration and some of the funding around that. There was a lot of pushback, however, in that this was a large development, one of the largest in the history of the county in this agricultural area. And it seemed like very quickly off the heels of that project was the Amazon plant, a data center plant. And as I understand it, in a larger context, it has a lot to do with the energy grid and the PJM network that runs, across the country and the attractiveness to these larger companies around that.
Can you take a little bit, people to have a better understanding, because people need to know what PJM is. Dive into there, because PJM, in the most simplest terms, help me understand this, is it's basically who controls our energy flow and what we plug into on the grid.
And again, I'll say I'm not an expert on the grid system, but I do know it stretches from the east coast of the United States, kind of runs through our part of the world and wraps up around the Great Lakes, Lake Michigan into Chicago. And so many of these end user companies, high-tech companies, are looking to take advantage of that. And then the local provider is called AEP. And so they, in concert with companies like Amazon, were looking for locations and with large parcels of land available, and counties like ours looking for economic development. That's where this marriage took place.
Yeah, because one thing that gets me so frustrated in this is, and Michelle, I want you to jump in this from the state perspective, because when you talk about PGM, when you talk about AEP, I know we're using acronyms, but this is the large energy infrastructure. What gets me frustrated about the State House is about 20 or 30 years, we were forewarned. Everybody across the country were told we need to update our infrastructure. It is coming. Manufacturing is changing. Energy demands are changing. We're moving into clean energy. We're moving into electric cars. But 20 years of GOP control, we've been kicking the can down the road. So here we are, where we have a stressed out system. It's one of the reasons why our energy bills are going so up, and we don't have folks in place that understand how to get us out of there. What, in terms of the governor's, I forget her name, correct me if I'm wrong, but who's sitting in her energy council, she has said, well, if we get these data centers here, if we get these great economic opportunities, and I say that in air quotes, they can help us upgrade our grid. So they're defaulting to these entities to help us get out of a problem that, in my opinion, when you look at it, they created. And I want to ask you to jump in, Michelle, and to expand on that, because when you look at where we are, that's their argument right now.
I guess I look at this really from more the resource side of things, and the fact that I find it curious that many of the locations are being proposed by the utility companies who actually make the bulk of their profit from the infrastructure development.
Yeah.
So they're creating, it's basically a forced demand on a captive consumer. And I don't know how many times we've actually connected all of the dots, especially when we're looking at utility companies that have been purchased by private equity. So now we have an AI boom that many investors are looking at it very much like a bubble kind of thing. And that is driving a demand for alternative energy sources, such as the small modular nuclear reactors, which coincidentally need the same kind of land that the data centers do, which need the same kind of infrastructure that the utility companies can make more money off of when they develop it out. And there doesn't seem to be really any guardrails. The other thing that I'm looking at is the watersheds. And we don't actually link a lot of our districts to the watersheds that impact them. And so, for example, I am learning from people who are very deeply invested in that if you say take water from one resource or one aquifer for a project, but then you put the wastewater into a different river or body of water, it actually affects the downstream, obviously, of the watershed. So, for example, we're looking at White River and the things that are coming off of the White River upstream, while they're proposing data centers downstream, but they haven't actually answered where the treated wastewater is going to go. And I just feel like across the board, a lot of these places where the data centers are going, everyone is asking the same questions and they're not getting the answers. Now we're starting to see finally local governments having the courage to push pause and say, we're going to wait for 6 months or 12 months until we know a little bit more what's happening so we can make informed decisions. Because again, back to what Jan's saying, we need economic development in this state, but it cannot be at the expense of our health. When we have a sick population, it doesn't matter what jobs are available. They won't be able to attend them. So, yeah.
Yeah, Cindy, I'll let you jump in here and jump into the conversation. What's happening down in your district that mirrors what we're talking about?
All of it. It's the balance between economic development and jobs. And in two of the cases, they're promoting union jobs and local union jobs, where they're saying it'll be 10 years worth of union jobs. But what's the reality of that is, as Michelle said, we have a network of aquifers in our state. And the two sites that are proposed in the 6th district right now are right on top of some of our largest aquifers in the state. So where they're drawing that down from affects a lot of people. And then again, you have the power issue. And they're claiming that as the power as it sits now, it's not a problem, and they have enough power to run these two particular data centers. However, during our last winter storm last weekend, all the residents in those two counties were advised to cut their power usage as much as possible. So there's a lot that's not being said. There's a lot that's not, people aren't being transparent about. There are the backup generation that will serve these these proposed data centers, should the power outages happen, are diesel generator based, which have its own set of problems and need to be tested every month and put nitrous oxide and sulfur dioxide out. And there's I think putting pause on things is an indication that people want to really think about what the impact is going to be 5, 10, 20 years in the future, and not just look at the immediate returns that they might get.
I think you hit the nail on the head. Go ahead, Jan. Then we're going to get to a question in the chat, but go right ahead, please.
Well, here in St. Joe County, of course, we have reputedly the largest data center in the country. I don't know now, the things move so quickly. We were able to, in the county, to deny the zoning change for an additional 1,000-acre right next to the 1,000-acre development. AEP repeatedly claims there's plenty of energy for everybody, but the statistics and numbers behind that are sketchy. And then we have the Microsoft, another 900-acre data center that's going in on the east side. I'm calling for a pause. I'm calling for a moratorium in St. Joe County as a candidate for county council, because we haven't assessed what we've done so far. We haven't looked at the impact. We haven't taken the wisdom from the rest of the state. And we shouldn't be considering any additional. We think the developer for that project that was turned down may come back again. So we need to be so much better prepared and so much more on top of restrictions and regulations.
Right. Michelle, I want to ask you if you can confirm this, because we had this conversation before when we were talking about data centers. Jan, I think you hit the nail on the head. The development might get a no in this county, but the state has a list. They have a list of areas where if they get a no here, let's move over here, because I think this county council and these county commissioners, we're going to get in there. So I think that's important for us to know. Michelle, I want you to jump in here, and then I want to get to a question in the chat.
No, absolutely. And I think that the impact of the SEA1 or SB1 budget bill that passed in 2025 really has impacted local governments to where I think they're kind of feeling that their arm is pulled behind their back, and they have to make these decisions. And so where we really need to see more local control is not only under the decisions that they make, but also the information that they not only have access to, but that they can share with the public. So these non-disclosure agreements that come in before anything is said, it either divides the local government or it hamstrings them on what they can publicly say. And I think that it's a shame that we haven't seen more. Again, it's the guardrails that come up. We want the best opportunities, and these businesses coming in are not treating us, I don't think, as good neighbors. We would not accept this from a small business coming in on Main Street. I'll say. And I don't understand why we have so many regulations for small business, but on these major corporations that impact everybody, not just their local economies, it seems like there is not the same kind of due diligence.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head when we talk about this, because as I look at it from a messaging strategic standpoint and a strategy standpoint, these companies have 5, 10-year plans. They are looking across the country. Where can we go? In order for them to get here, which leads into the question in the chat, why are they being offered tax abatements and these amazing tax, in their minds, these great tax incentives to land here in Indiana? And I see, Jan, you shaking your head. I'll let you jump in. And because this is where I push back and say, based on this conversation and what we said about all the scientific and all the downstream effects, I challenge those folks sitting in the State House, not all of them, to even begin to go head to head with you folks who understand this. And it's who we're voting for, who are looking at a short-term messaging win. Oh, look what I did. I brought this development here. Or look at what we've got, a few more jobs in our community. But that is like the short term. We have the guardrails aren't there. We're not looking long term, and they're dangling tax incentives. So talk about that tax incentive piece that allows for these companies to come here without a plan, without us understanding what the long term, and yet how did the local folks not ask the right questions is really where I want to go with the next question to this. So
Well,
Jan, I'll let you jump into that one.
Yeah, I think it's a very standard practice when it comes to economic development that tax abatements are put forth as a way to attract companies. So it's not an unusual tactic. But when you're dealing with companies that are these huge billionaire type companies, they don't need the tax abatement. So I just don't think that we were really prepared to push back and to say, no, if you're not going to come without a tax abatement, you can't come here, and kind of test the ground. The other controversial piece is the establishment of the TIF districts, which restricts the tax revenue that is generated within a confined area, and so it kind of starves the rest of the county. So all of these promises of tax dollars, it's a little bit deceptive because it's going to be very restricted.
Can you explain to folks what a TIF district is? Because that keeps coming up, and I see in social media people are a little confused about that and what that actually is.
Well, it stands for a tax increment financing, and so you draw a boundary around the area. Any new tax revenue is used for infrastructural investments and improvements within that area. It typically is used more in infill urban development in areas that are challenged. It's a new entity of TIF where you're taking in thousands and thousands of acres and confining that tax money within that size of an area. And you multiply that by, now we're going to potentially have 3 1,000-acre projects. It really puts a dent in where you can use those tax dollars.
Who does that benefit, that structural TIF, the way it's happening here in Indiana? Who's benefiting from those TIF districts?
As I understand it with Amazon, I don't mean to dominate here, but
Yeah.
it goes back into the infrastructure of that industrial development around the Amazon, so the sewers, the roads, et cetera.
So basically, just so I understand you, because this is a complex thing, and that's one of the reasons why we're having these conversations, and to see the parallels is we're giving them tax incentives, and we're also giving them the advantage of the TIF district. Okay.
And on top of that, oftentimes we're, partnering in on other infrastructure investments, roads, interchanges, right, in support of that project.
Okay. I want to jump into there's a question in the chat, and this is really something that people are really talking about is, let me see, I don't have much knowledge about this, but I have 2 comments. One is that there should be no tax abatements. How can it benefit the state? If so, how much land is given away? So it's a land question. And the other one, the other is that the increased energy needs of these facilities are bound to increase energy costs. And all of those increased costs could be absorbed by those facility companies and not pushed onto the rest of the populace. So I'd like, either somebody to jump in here. So we're talking the land and we're talking the energy costs. And when I go around the state and I talk to folks and I listen on social media and I find out what their concerns are, the questions they're asking at these community meetings, they're not getting answers, is what I'm seeing. And they're not getting anywhere, but yet these developments are continue on. So what are we looking at here? I'll have anybody jump in on these questions and my follow-up.
I think the one thing I would love to add to this conversation is I think about how the budgets are, and Indiana prides itself on having, the balanced budget, and it seems to me that there is not a line item in our state budget that talks about the cumulative amount of tax abatements or whatever. It's like, we don't need this money. And so they say yes to this thing and yes to that thing, and that's 2 million, 5 million, 4 billion, 4 billion. There's no cumulative. And then they're still turning around and making this balanced budget while cutting more programs, right? So they're not bringing in income versus any corporation and any nonprofit even, that's not how they do their budgets. They're looking at 1 year, 5 year, 10-year plans. What do we need in revenue to reach our goal, our vision? So it sometimes I'm just kind of surprised that everything is a scarcity. It keeps reinforcing a scarcity. And the other question that I often ask people is when we talk about, you and I and everybody else, we hear the term fixed income. We have people on fixed income. So even in this conversation, can you name who is fixed income in your community? And most people will come up with senior citizens, those on disability, veterans. Very rarely, if ever, will somebody say salaried worker.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have more and more of these other expenses like energy costs and groceries and living expenses go up, salaried workers don't have much wiggle room. And you have a gig economy that has no benefit, so there's no social safety net for them. And that's where the squeeze is happening. So even in an economic development vision, it's hard for people to understand, why is Amazon getting these 50-year tax abatements, or even under the data centers, and the fact that they don't have to pay tax on equipment, sales tax. Like that makes no sense
Yeah.
when they're going to be buying these equipment in 6 month increments. Like that cumulative impact of a lack of revenue, I don't understand when we have the bulk of our population either on fixed income or zero safety nets.
Yeah. Cindy, I'd like you to jump in here because you're running for Congress. And when you offer a vision, what do you see as an opportunity to change the structure or what's happening, what Michelle says? Because policy happens at the federal level, but execution happens at the state level.
I think that's an important distinction to make. One of the things that's happening at the local level is we don't have experts in these areas sitting on our local councils and commissioner boards. And right now, I can't find, other than maybe a couple of groups that have been advocating for environmental responsibility across the state for a number of years, any independent organizations aligned with the state of Indiana to provide information that is not politically directed. And I think that's very troubling right now at the state level and also at the federal level, because we're seeing at the federal level a lot of our policies that were instituted in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s being stripped away, being weakened, and being watered down to the point where they're just not viable any longer. I think everybody remembers the Pacific Gas and Electric disaster that contaminated the water supply in California. When at the federal level, we have these rules and these protections for a reason, because things happened. And when I was teaching my classes, I took students who were 16, 17, 18 years old through the history of all those things that have happened. And my guess is if we went to all of these commissioners and council people, they might know a little bit of that history, but they probably don't know the real reasons why all of these, and even CEOs, I'm going to guess, don't know a lot of the reasons why we do have these environmental protections in place, and the reasons why they have the teeth in them that they had before. That is one of the reasons why I decided to run, and how I got to Washington on my fellowship was the EPA was being consistently weakened, and my students were asking me why. And when we put profits and corporate profits ahead of people's health and people's safety, that's where that rub comes in, and that's where we really need our government to be working effectively for us, independently, and giving us true facts.
With these big data centers coming here, we've got the big Google one also happening, that they calling that one a hyper center too, up in Fort Wayne. 5 years from now, if these data centers go as they see fit, without putting the regulations and the safety precautions and the environmental protections as the guardrails Michelle said, what do you see for our future here in Indiana if we continue down this path?
Well, the hyperscales are bigger than, I think they're bigger than 150,000 homes, like all at once in one center. So you've just essentially increased your population without, I mean, in a very short amount of time, without addressing infrastructure, without addressing, those concerns of any kind of pollution, any kind of mitigation of pollution. What I would like to see from those contracts, especially on those large facilities, is something written in to protect ratepayers, residents, consumers, whatever we want to call them, people who will have to live with the fallout of this, and maybe some sort of a bond that they have to pay to ensure that any disaster or anything that would happen would have to be cleaned up.
Absolutely. Jan, I know you only have a few more minutes, but you have worked across this country in other urban development projects. Where do you see, as to piggyback off what Cindy said, where do you see that we really can push back? Because some of these data centers are down the tracks. And where can community members jump in and be really forceful to make sure some of these guardrails are now put in place when we're developing these areas? Because some contracts are already signed. What do we do at this point, at this juncture?
Well, I think the encouraging news is the public has woken up and they're engaged, and they need to keep pushing on getting information. And now everybody's learning what some of these regulations are. We can, with good, we're now informed to be able to make those arguments for what kind of regulation should be put into play. And we can start to pressure the people running for office and to begin to elect those people who have this knowledge and this perspective. My view is that technology changes so quick. I don't see these data centers even existing in the way they are now and their scale in another 5 to 10 years. So now we got these big behemoths with this big infrastructure. Who's going to pay for the cleanup of all of that? It's going to shrink. It's going to operate differently. So in addition to those bonds for energy and so on, I think we need to be thinking more long term.
Yeah. I see that the folks that are sitting around the power tables who have the power are not asking the right questions. They're not pushing back. They're not thinking of what the community says. And from a messaging standpoint, what I see happening is in Indiana, because this is how we fight back together, because this issue is happening in Fort Wayne, it's happening in St. Joe, it's happening in Shelby, it's happening in other districts across the state. We need to work together to elevate that same conversation, because from a messaging standpoint where I sit, if we individually address these issues, it doesn't work. It only works when we're all talking on the same page, we're singing from the same hymn book, we're fighting it together, because that's how the noise elevates. It's always bottom up. And then from a strategy standpoint, then our elected officials start to go, oh, we're getting some pressure. But until they get that pressure, they're going to think, because here's the other thing that I want to hear from Cindy and Michelle, and I know, Jan, let us know when you have to jump off.
Yeah, I'm going to have to take off.
What really, thank you, Jan. Go see your students, and we will talk to you again, because we have to keep this conversation going. This fight's not over. So thank you for the time that you were able to give us today. Thank you. Bye now. What I want to talk about is, I feel like there's a false setup for our mayors who are pushing for these economic opportunities and saying yes to these data centers. And then now there's a rub within our party, our coalition, our organizations, and the unions, because the unions are like, okay, well, this is a job that I'm going to have for the next 3 to 4 years. I would like that income. What else is on the table for me? And then these mayors are saying, we need this economic development in our community. And they're getting pushback from all different entities, but choosing to move forward with this economic development. So I'd love to hear your folks. What are your thoughts on that? Because I don't think we're setting ourselves up for success in our communities by leaning into this type of economic development.
I think that if we look at how Europe has dealt with some of these negotiations, they model some pathways forward. And Mary, you've written about this in the past. So I sometimes find and get frustrated that we think we have to recreate the wheel, when if we've seen others model something successfully, let's learn from that. The other thing is every one of these has a detailed contract. And you're going to find that at the local level, if it starts at zoning, well, all they're looking at is the zoning rules, right? That's their power. But maybe there's another deliverable or a due date of which certain things are needing to happen. That needs to be monitored. Who is keeping track of that and making sure that it's not just once one thing's done, it's all rubber stamped through. And I think that type of negotiation is very much at the local level, and the public can empower, it by showing up to these meetings and staying on track with watching what's happening, and holding their local electeds accountable to follow through on the terms and conditions of these contracts. And then lastly, I think always by staying in communication, at the end of the day, these are companies with company reputations that they don't want to be the villain in a story, right?
Right.
And so at the end of the day, what can Indiana do? What can we federally do to really encourage these corporations to do right? We're all have the same kind of resources of water and all of this. So I think it really is reminding the interconnectedness of this. We need the tools that AI is bringing. We need the tools that technology has. We need the jobs that this offers. But going back to, again, we just need the guardrails that make it the best, and the environmental protections that they were voted in because of some really harmful things that have happened in the past, and we don't need to fall back into that because the generation that lived through that transition is gone. We need those stories and that knowledge base to carry over, so that we can make more informed decisions.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I say this all the time because somebody just wrote in the comments, we need more women elected. I'm like, yep, because we're taking the time to understand these issues, and they're just signing the contracts without reading the fine print. Cinde, what's happening down in your district when you're on the campaign trail and people are really concerned about these data centers? How are they getting impact in their community? Are they getting communication? Have they been brought into the conversation? Or are we really at this point where it's an afterthought and we're playing defense? Because that's the conversation I want to have after this is, we don't have to be on defense, but here in Indiana, we've got this posture of, this is what's going to happen. This is good enough. But I want to hear what's happening on the campaign trail down in that district, because you guys are having 3 data centers come into play.
What I am seeing is that those non-disclosure agreements have resulted in the delay of minutes from meetings being put out to the public.
Interesting.
Sometimes months. I mean, almost close to a year. And with that lack of transparency, that puts us on the defense in every case that I've seen because of those non-disclosure agreements. How those non-disclosure agreements are legal when you're looking at public entities and public policy, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't get into that part, but it seems to me that is contraindicative to anything that benefits the public. So when I talk to people who are against them, they are worried about their water. They're worried about the quality of their water. They're worried about the cost of their power. In Indiana, I think our power's already gone up over 20% in the last 10 years or 5 years. And that's a significant increase. As Michelle said, most of us are on fixed incomes, whether, no matter what it is. And I think even when you look at people who are hourly, that still is a fairly fixed income. So, most of our population is surviving right now and not thriving. And I think it's a great concern when, your rates have already gone up over 20%. What's it going to be if they come in? Is anybody even thinking about people who are already struggling? Or is it just how can we make ourselves look good now that we've been elected and we want to say that we're bringing these things, but we're not really thinking all the way around the problem and 20 years down the line. And I think people are thinking that. People have seen groundwater polluted. They have seen their wells dry up. They have seen what happens in a drought. Farmers in the 6th District are connected to their land. And what I hear farmers saying is, what's going to happen in the next drought? Because we do get droughts in Indiana. We have these aquifers that, really do help us. What will happen? Are we all going to lose our farms, when this happens? What's going to happen in the next major winter storm? Are we going to be asked to not have heat to let the data center keep going? Those are questions I've heard asked. And again, I will reiterate that I'm not sure there is a place for local county and city officials to go to get unbiased information other than the people who are proposing the data centers.
I think that's a really good point, because what we saw here in St. Joseph County is when people were coming and asking a lot of questions of their county council folks, they didn't have the answers. And it was very discouraging as community members because they were already that way down the path. They were saying, the way they were framing the people's concern about water, energy, electric bills, construction, the development folks would get up and say, that's in the plan. They've committed to. We're going to be discussing that. This is the phase we're at. It is coming. But yet the city council folks voted a yes for some of this stuff under the assumption that these issues will get addressed later. Now, when I put on my corporate lens, I was like, if I ever signed a contract on the hope of a whim of a maybe, that's a legal lawsuit waiting to happen, right? Like, how are we doing this?
Right.
That's what baffles me. And to answer my own question is, we have to start collectively fighting and pushing back to get the answers. It's not going to come with one-offs. I use the example of redistricting. Why did we win new districting in a very gerrymandered state that people perceive us to be so red? We're rigged, not red. Is because we were all orchestrating the same fight. We were elevating it to the point where we were working with our electeds, we were asking tough questions, and we were leaning in together. And it brought people across the aisle, because a message doesn't penetrate unless we're all asking the same questions, all talking about the same thing. When you've got one community dealing with a tough issue, it doesn't land. But when we start to see it go into the ecosystem, that's where we're at. So when I say that, what comes up for you folks? How do we fight this in a way that we continue to elevate the conversation? Because people are concerned about water. They're concerned about property values going down when their property and their homes are near these big data centers. So where do we go from here? We know the problems, we know the challenges. Here we are. The state has created the avenue and the opportunities for them to easily slide in. Now we're down at the local level. This is happening. Where do we go from here?
When I was at the Shelby County meeting, and I had highlighted the point that that same evening there was another one of the data center meetings 35 miles down the road in Knightstown, I couldn't get out of the Shelby County meeting when I left because people were following me out to ask me questions about the one happening in Knightstown. And I think getting the issue out there that this is not a one-off, this is not just your county. When Hancock County defeated theirs, it immediately went to the adjacent county. I think when people know that this is an intentional spread across Indiana and that it's affecting so many Hoosiers, just like the redistricting was, I think that is one of our best steps forward to engage the public.
Yeah.
I'd also like to chime in that there are organizations that have been leading this for quite some time, and one of those is Citizens Action Coalition, ctac.org. Another one that's picking it up to help statewide is Hoosier Action at hoosieraction.org. And then, of course, Mad Voters, they follow a lot of the legislation that impacts this. And I'm also involved with it's an online resource hub called organizingindiana.org that has a whole list of different organizations, of which these three are part of, and it really is getting involved at a local level. Go to the meetings, and getting involved at the statewide level to amplify and share the voices of people having these experiences. The other thing I am reminded of, because I lived for over 20 years in Los Angeles, and that was at the height of the whole Enron thing. And when Enron bought out PG&E, and they were effectively creating a false scarcity so that they could drive up energy costs. And again, I cannot reiterate enough that my biggest concern sometimes with these data centers is simply a complete 24/7 demand on energy at the highest cost rate. So if I were private equity looking at a way to make a huge amount of money, that is a piggy bank right there. And what Enron did in their shell game was they would tell one power plant to shut down so that it would put more demand on the grid so that they could make a profit. And we're talking even just a matter of hours, the amount of profit that happens. So to see, I was impacted when there was a fire that caused some significant damage to a power station. And later on, when they had captured the audio of some of the techs with Enron, or the day traders, and one of them was laughing, saying, "Burn, baby, burn," while they're watching the news story of a fire that was less than 2 miles from my house.
Oh, wow.
There's something that hits you in your gut when you see that type of predatorial action. And so it's going to be a collective mobilization of people across the state, whether you have a data center in your backyard or not, to stand in solidarity. And we have organizations that are leading the way. And my advice is get involved and follow their direction. And when they have an action alert of call your legislator or show up at the state house or write your government official, that we follow their lead because they have the tools for us.
Yeah.
They do,
And my
and
other,
they do
go
good
ahead, Cindy.
work. The other thing that we need to keep in mind, as Michelle said, this could all be part of a bigger issue, is we're seeing across different sectors surge pricing. And if the surge pricing hits our energy, then this would be ripe for consumers footing the bill even more for these data centers. I do think the Citizens Action Coalition does excellent work, and they have helped a lot of the organizers on the ground in the counties that I've been working in, to sort of weed through this and give them the actual facts. My concern is a lot of the people who are elected do not use them as a resource.
Yeah. It's funny. Michelle and I have been in conversation with folks in Virginia and their big win in 2025. And one of the lessons and takeaways, we've had several conversations with the folks, and they've been really great mentoring us and like moving the needle here. And one thing that I really want to point out that was really powerful that the team over there mentioned was when the voters on the ground push from the bottom up, the elected start listening, regardless of what side of the aisle. So when when our coalitions start coming together, asking the tough questions, holding them accountable, then they turn around and go, "Oh, voters, what do you need? What do you want? How do you want us to ask those questions?" So I understand some of our electorates are looking at, and this is not a judgment, but they're looking at what can we get, and they're taking a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Their power lens will shift if we support them in the push, because then they don't feel like they're going out on a limb by themselves. So a lot of these mayors are saying yes, or not, or folks on the front lines are saying, well, maybe we should do this, because they don't know that they have support behind them. And that's a human thing too, and I get that. And when we talk about resources, I'm a big believer that, like Michelle mentioned, in Europe, they only have 500 or plus data centers, 35 or so, 535. We have close to 3,000. I just put the link in the chat. You can look at where all the data centers are across our country. If you want to put this type of structure in Europe, there is a checklist. Why don't we have that checklist? We need to come to our meetings with this checklist and say, if you look at my Democratic dilemma, if you go on Substack, if you talk about, there's a picture of Bezos, I think, believe there, where I said elections matter. So we need to start asking these folks these questions. If Europe can have this checklist of environmental mitigations, structural needs that have to happen, water, etc., why can't we? We're just not asking and pushing and asking the right questions. What's happening to us is we're getting wind to this after contracts are signed and it's already down the pike. Point the finger at the state house, start electing better state representatives so we can look at other ways of economic development when we talk about what's possible. We're living in this scarcity mindset that we'll take what we can get, take scraps, take a few wins. To me, that's not a win. So the other thing that I put in my the Democratic dilemma was, which I'm a big person that really wants to better understand this, is, which goes along with these data centers, is Indiana has been kicking the can down the trail and not addressing our energy infrastructure. So I feel like we're at a crossroads. We're having these two things happening at the same time. We've got this push for these data centers with that they want to plug into something, and at the same time, Indiana has stayed on coal. And the Trump administration is pushing us to stay on coal and not advancing and fixing a broken system that needed some work anyway. It's old. Everything has to be fixed. So it goes back to who you voting for, regardless you're Democratic, Republican. These chuckleheads, a lot of people laugh. I say that all the time. That's my term. Are not addressing the needs of their community. They're just going along. And I will also add, this is what happens when you leave 30 House seats uncontested, 32 House seats uncontested on the Democratic side, and 8 on the Senate side last year, and 10 previous year. If you don't have people running for office, even some of the hardest areas, these issues are not addressed. The electeds who are making these decisions are not held accountable. I know that's my soapbox, but Josh, are there any other questions in the chat? Michelle, did you want to jump in there?
I was just trying to think. A thought came and it's quickly gone. So we'll circle back to that if Josh has any.
Josh, any questions in the chat that I want to make sure we get asked, that people can come off and ask their questions? Well, yes. Okay. So 20 to 40% property increase in those counties. That was post-COVID. That was just economics. That was just the market values in a lot of places across the country. That's just not Bartholomew County. People are very concerned that now these Google data centers, these hypercenters, are being parked next to their neighborhoods. And in 5 years, when they go to sell, they're going to see their individual neighborhood property values go down. And that's what they've seen across the country. So you've got what happened with property taxes rising because that was a national thing in terms of housing market, in terms of interest rates, etc. But people are really, really super concerned, rightfully so, because they've had it seen. They have had it seen happen in other communities where you have pockets of neighborhoods directly impact. So, any other questions? Really good question. Any of you folks want to jump in before I jump in?
I think the value that keeps coming to my mind really is people matter. People matter, right? So when we hear about, for example, the jobs and that the unions are rightfully concerned that they've got these construction jobs. So are we throwing them under the bus, right? At the same time, once the data centers are up and running, especially the hyperscaler ones, we're being told already that AI is going to be taking white collar jobs, and so there's not even been an assessment on what that economic impact is. At every step of this narrative, it seems like people are being deemed as expendable. Yeah. And I think our value has to constantly be, at every negotiation point, are people being centered? are they the ones that are, who is being economically impacted? Who will be benefiting from this, short term and long term? And again, it goes back to, we don't have to say a blanket no to this, but there needs to be guidelines and coming to a table with a commitment that this is benefiting not only the most local community that's impacted, but then across the state. And I feel like we have missed that mark completely. But even within most of our values in Indiana, it seems to be business friendly, business, and not people. And at the end of the day, people are what make up business. It is not some amorphous thing.
The
Yeah.
other part of that is that, the unions are really pushing that they've been promised all of these jobs. And this wouldn't be such an issue if we could elect people in Indiana who could reverse our situation with the workforce and undo our right to work state. In that case, then we wouldn't have unions fighting for something that could be detrimental for all of us, 5-10 years down the road for a short-term win. There could be long-term wins that, as Michelle said, center people completely.
Yeah, you've heard me say this over and over. Democrats need to own the economic argument. If we're going to win future elections, and it's not about, we need to go up to the line and be really forceful. Yes, we believe in economic development. We want it, but it doesn't have to be this, as Michelle and Cindy just said. We're used to saying, okay, we want to make sure our union's happy, but we're not willing to position ourselves with a framework of moving forward and having a better plan. And we don't have to, Michelle, you mentioned this in the beginning, we don't have to recreate the wheel. We can look at other states of how their energy grids are working, how they're leaning into clean energy, how they're leaning into different types of jobs and trainings. Look at the state of Massachusetts. You can go to community college and you don't have to pay. One of the reasons for that is when I was back in Massachusetts, NIPSCO, the energy folks in Massachusetts were noticing their lines, the technologies were all advancing, and they didn't have a labor force to cover their jobs. They went to the community college and they in tandem created a curriculum. Helped NIPSCO, helped folks getting their degrees, and they created a system. Why can't we get better at presenting opportunities that benefit everybody across our state instead of just the big corporations? We're not living in possibility and thinking in a way that would allow for there to be winners on both sides of the aisle. And I don't mean the political aisle, I mean the corporations having advancement and creating job opportunities, but the workers need to also win. You'll hear me say that the contract's broken. We have a state government that the contract that they're looking at all the time is to benefit the corporations. We are left out of the equation. So it's our job to push back and say it doesn't have to be like this. It's the same thing with the immigration argument. We can support secure, safe borders and treating our fellow neighbors with humanity. It's not an and or. I think we live in this and or situation where it doesn't have to be like that. Another question. Cindy wants to undo our status as a right to work. Did I hear that right?
I think that we've seen what's happened to workers in the past, 25 years as a work to right state. And I think, when unions are wanting to take whatever scrap that they can to survive, and when I see, 30 union people brought in to promote a data center because they're going to get 10 years of jobs and training, that tells us that something is broken in our state. And when we look to other states who have successful labor practices, I think we need to be looking to them for leadership and for guidance, and looking at what is broken within our own state.
Yeah, I would agree. So how do we practically do this without us seeming like we're anti-union or anti-job? Great question. I'm going to take this, and I'd love to hear you folks. What I think we miss here as Democrats is we miss and we don't get forceful in our messaging to assign blame. We are very, we don't want to, play nice in the sandbox. This isn't a time to play nice. This is a time to actually keep it simple, but also assign blame of why this is happening. You've heard me say this before. It's the 3V sandwich. Lead with values, call out the villain, and offer the future of what's possible. But we have a tendency to walk away from not going up to that line. The line has been drawn. We need to step over it and start having this conversation.
And
Michelle,
I think we can't be afraid of looking at the facts too, and looking at the facts as how they have affected people.
I would also say, again, back to the people, I have no problem naming villains as the private equity. I really don't. And I say that because it just seems like it is a faceless machine that is always just looking at profit, and that there has to be unrestrained growth. Well, in a biological organism, unrestrained growth is cancer, right? And so it brings to question, like, if we actually had these companies coming in paying their fair share, what could then be invested in the bricks and mortar of our communities so that Main Street thrives? Now, how many jobs are at the hyper local level right now? Those are going further and further away. And so to me, the best pro job, the best pro growth would be more investment at a hyper local level. But we've just had a budget cut that totally stripped funding from education and from our local governments and put it on the backs of taxpayers to do even more local taxes. And our property taxes haven't been really reprieved. So I feel like we're getting hit on all these different fronts just so that certain corporations can benefit the most. And it's almost a fear-based response. Like, these are too big to fail companies, and we have to treat them like kid gloves so that they actually come into our state to, exploit us more? I don't know. They dangle a carrot of a promised return, but it's the same carrot that they're dangling to investors. And again, I want to go back to Enron. When Enron went belly up, right before that, they had demanded all of their PG&E employees to now switch to Enron in their 401k, 100%. They could not diversify their 401k. When they went belly up, they pulled out all that they could. They froze the assets of these employees who were in retirement funds. And there was one man's story where he had close to 500,000 saved in his 401k, and he was down to less than 50,000. That is violence. So when we're talking about ICE raids and all of that, and that is absolute violence, economic violence is economic violence too. And I think we forget to name that. And especially when you get into the blue state, red state thing, the economic violence that has happened to red states is partly why we have the Trump in office. I'll be honest, because people have been calling out saying, you are having an extractive economy in my state, and nobody is listening. The Republicans didn't listen. The Democrats didn't listen. Trump came in and basically said, we're going to do something, and it was going to be a drastic thing. It didn't really benefit anybody for us at all.
No.
But it was something that they could hold on to. And I think we just need to keep naming that if you do not put people first and listen to them when they are saying, hey, quit stepping on my foot, then we're going to end up in these problems where, and even the fact that we're having this thing of union jobs versus non-union jobs and who gets employed. Everybody needs to be employed. Everybody needs to have the opportunity.
Yep. I would add too to that is, we saw this with Project 2025. They've been in the works with these types of actions for a long time, like to take away union rights, the right to work, all their planning, and has not come out of just nowhere. It's been a big plan, a big vision of theirs to move forward with this. When you ask how do we message around that, we find ourselves on defense quite a bit. The reactive and defensive. We're like, and I see that on social media a lot in terms of messaging. They're always pointing out people of what's going on. They're argumentative. I get it. But what we need to do is hold up our book of a plan, because people don't know what's possible for an alternative. And I think that's much more powerful, added to holding them accountable, but also making sure we're offering what's possible in a plan forward. Because if we're just showing up and saying, hey, let's not vote for this, that doesn't help people see a vision of why, truly understanding what can be possible, how we can move our communities forward, how can we have Main Street back, how can we have clean water, etc., or what's possible. And we know other areas it is possible in terms of how they're moving their community forwards. We're a target because our elected officials are not. We're not holding them accountable. They're just signing on the dotted line. They're just siding with the corporations, and we're being left out of the conversation as community members, as citizens here in Indiana. When you look at the map of the United States and you look at the red states who are rigged, this is where a lot of these issues have started, and that's where they grow and have entered into the federal conversation, but they started here. So, with that being said, are there any more questions? I know we've had kind of a robust discussion. For me, I would like to just kind of say that thank you all for joining us. We need to keep talking about data centers. We need to be talking about how to frame these conversations. We need to see that these are not isolated incidences in my community or your community. This is a collective plan of how they think economic development should happen in our state. And as a result, our water is affected, our electric bills, our power, our aquifers, farmers. And I would also add that another reason why we have to have these conversations and share this out is because they control the narrative. We have to start controlling the narrative on what is actually happening in our communities. Just because they're louder does not mean they're right. So, Michelle, Cindy, I'll give you some time to add some final thoughts before we sign off. Who wants to jump in first before we sign off? Michelle, I'll let you go first.
Sure.
Direct.
Sure. So like I said, I'm with the Indiana Rural Summit, and we were able to take up about 24 candidates on January 7th to file. And so that was a huge success, and we've got more candidates that have signed up. You can learn more about us at indianaruralsummit.org. And again, I cannot stress enough, get involved at the local level, get involved in groups that you know across the state, stay informed.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And Cindy?
I'm Cindy Wirth. I'm running for U.S. House of Representatives, Indiana's 6th District, which is 11 counties across central Indiana. And I have been attending, the data center meetings and talking to people. So if you have any questions, reach out. Our website is www.wirth4congress.com. And one thing that I think people are starting to realize is that even if the data center's in Shelby County, but you live in Bartholomew County, you're on that top of the same aquifer. So everything is local and everything affects everybody else. Like Michelle said, I'm a biologist. We live in an ecosystem and everything affects everything else. So none of us are actually in isolation. So reach out if you have any questions.